One more thing I want to mention with regards to lambda functions is something called the default function for a class. So this is a bit weird, and it's actually something that we have in languages like C++ where it's called a functor. So that's why I call this particular lesson a functor, because that's the official name for it. But you could also say that it is a way of providing a default function for a class. So let's take a look at how that works. So I'm going to basically define any old class. Let's say I have a class which calculates the average. But instead of instantiating this class, I'm going to actually call this class, which is a bit weird. So I'm going to add a new function called invoke, which is going to take a couple of arguments. Let's have var arg. Let's have some values of type double, and we're going to return a double, which is going to be, well, as the name of the class now suggests, is going to be the average of the values. So I'll have var sum equals 0, and then I'm going to iterate x in values and increment the sum, increase the sum by the value, and then return sum divided by values.size. Okay, so this is my function for calculating the average, but it's a class. So typically the way you work with classes is as follows. Let's suppose that we have a bunch of values. So the way you would typically work with this is you'd say val a equals average, like this, and then you would say a dot, and you would actually call this function whatever it is. But this isn't how it's going to work, because in Kotlin there is a special function called invoke. So if you have a class which has a function called invoke, then you can do the round bracket operator right on the variable of type average, without having to actually instantiate it. So let me show you how this works. So we have the average here as a, and then we can calculate the actual average of a couple of values. And to do this, I'm going to take a, which is an instance of class average, and I'm going to open the round bracket here. So it's as if I'm calling the default operators, the round bracket operators, on an instance of the class. And here I can provide a few values, like 1, 2, and 3.0. So this is interesting. So the average, let's just print it out for completeness. Okay, so we got 2.0 as the average of 1, 2, and 3. And furthermore, what we can do is not just add this default function to a class that we make, but we can add a default function to any class, because remember, we have this wonderful syntax already available. So let's suppose that whenever I call the default function, whenever I call use the round bracket operators on a string, it takes the actual string and put round brackets around it. Let's implement this. So the way you'd implement it is something like the following. We're going to have a function called string.invoke. So notice we're adding the invoke function. Invoke is a special name, and we're adding it to a class called string. So it's going to return a string, and what we're going to do is we're going to return open round bracket plus this, where this refers to the actual string that we're calling this on, plus the closing round bracket. And what we can do now is we can, for example, say val2 equals, let's have a string 2, and I can say print line, I have 2, and then if I want 2 in round brackets, I would say dollar, and then 2, but I'm doing the default function call on it. So 2 is a string, but then I'm taking the string and I'm calling a function on it. This function has no arguments, but I could have easily added arguments in there as well. So I have 2 apples, for example. Let's run this. And as you can see, my word 2 now has round brackets around it, because that's how we implemented it in this particular function.